Hey guys, we're continuing this morning in our Sunday school series through the book of Matthew. Now, I say we're continuing. Obviously, this is the first video in the series, except for the brief introduction to Matthew video that I've already recorded. So if you want an introduction to Matthew, go grab that. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up kind of late in the book of Matthew. We're going to be following the ARP Quarterly's curriculum, and we're going to pick up with this week's lesson, the lesson for May the 3rd, which is going to be in this book, lesson 11, I believe, in the second half of Matthew. Lesson 10. So lesson 10, second half of Matthew in this. Now, if you've got this, great, that's fantastic, it'll help. If you want a copy of this and you don't have them, we have them at the church. You can stop by and pick one up, or if you want us to drop one off for you, we're happy to do that as well. But it's not 100% necessary for you to have this, because we're using this as a guide, we're using this as a base. But really what we're going to be doing is not so much looking at this as we are looking at this. So, if really all you need is a Bible, but I really do want you to have a Bible with you because I want you to be reading along. I want you to be studying it for yourself. As I'm referencing verses, I want you to be looking at them. You'll find it really, really helpful. So this week, what we're looking at is we are picking up with chapter 24 in Matthew, which conveniently is probably the most difficult chapter in all of Matthew to interpret, and that's what we're starting with this week. So I'm going to read the entire chapter. It's 51 verses, so this is going to take a bit, but again, the best thing we can do is be reading God's Word. So I'm going to read it, and then briefly, I'm going to kind of just take us through the chapter, explain a little bit, and talk about how it applies to us. So you've got your Bible at home, read along with me. I'm using the ESV. Any translation will work. I'm going to start with verse 1 of chapter 24. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. That if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. For from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were all unaware, until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 men will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake. You do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant, whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, so obviously long chapter, lot there. I'm not going to answer all your questions on this. I'm not going to fully explain this. That is 51 verses of all kinds of stuff going on, and in 25 minutes, I'm not going to be able to really fully unpack this. But what I will be able to do is I think I will be able to help us answer a few questions and help us understand the passage as a whole and what it's doing and why it's here. And if you've got more questions later or questions about anything that I say in this passage, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you more about it. We're just limited in time in this format, right? So you first need to know that there is a lot of disagreement as to how to interpret this passage, even within our own Reformed kind of church world. And the big question is, what is this talking about? Is this talking about the end times and Jesus' second coming? Is this talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70 when the Romans came in and just destroyed Jerusalem? Is it talking about both? If it's talking about both, what's part's talking about which one? What's this abomination of desolation thing? What does it mean when Jesus says that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place? There's a lot of questions about this passage. So just know that there's a lot of disagreement about it, even within our circles. Know that if you do have this and you're following along, this kind of takes a bit of a generalist approach because the people writing this are aware there's different opinions about it, so they don't really land on one. They kind of go more general. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you what I think this passage means because I think it's the best understanding of this passage. And that is that this is about both the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and Jesus' second coming. And it's also about the entirety of the time before Jesus' second coming. So you have several things going on here. Let me explain why I think that. We have to start with the context, right? So we are in the third section of Matthew. If you don't know what that means, go watch the other video I posted talking about the introduction and outline to the book of Matthew. And sorry, I hope the sound is okay because it's a very windy day out here. And more specifically, we're in the last week of Jesus' earthly life. He is in Jerusalem, the triumphal entry has happened, and there's all this stuff going on in Jerusalem surrounding the Passover and the temple and the Pharisees, and at the end of this week, in just a couple days, Jesus is going to die. And this whole week is marked by conflict with the Pharisees in the temple. And you gotta know that is just kind of the huge thing going on here. Obviously, Jesus is the Son of God, and he's saying that he is the way, and he has the answers to all the questions, and everything points to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders and the Sadducees are all about their own power. So, more than that, the temple literally dominated Jerusalem. Okay, this was the temple that had been rebuilt under Herod, and it was massive. This thing was huge, and it was the center of Jewish religious worship. And at a high feast like the Passover that's about to happen, like hundreds of thousands of animals would be slaughtered in a day there, and millions of people would be there. And this is a huge thing that dominates both literally in terms of the physical aspects of Jerusalem. It's the biggest building. It's up on the mount. It's ornate. It's elaborate. It's covered in gold and carvings and all these things. It physically dominates Jerusalem, and it metaphorically dominates Jerusalem because the temple was the center of life in Jerusalem. So, verses 1, 2, and 3 are really key for us to get what this chapter is talking about because they set the context. Verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So his disciples are like, look at this place, look at that, look at that, look at that, right? Jesus responds, he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So he says, hey, all these buildings, guys, these buildings that you see, this is all going to pass away. It will all be destroyed. So then, verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, so geography, Jesus is not staying in Jerusalem, okay? So if you've got, Jerusalem here, okay? And then to the east of Jerusalem, there is this town called Bethany, which is where Jesus was staying. He'd stay in Bethany. He'd come in for the day and be around the temple, and then he'd go back out. And to do that, you had to cross the Mount of Olives, which is this mountain east of Jerusalem, which overlooked the whole thing, right? So what would have happened is Jesus has left the temple. It's the end of the day. They're leaving. The disciples are pointing all this stuff out. And they say this, and Jesus says this is all going to be destroyed. And then as he sat on the Mount of Olives, so as they've gone part way back and they've stopped for a rest or for dinner or whatever, they're sitting on the mountain overlooking the entire city, seeing Jerusalem. And that is when the disciples come to him asking this question: when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So that's really key. The disciples ask two questions. When will these things be? The thing that Jesus just talked about, right? The temple being destroyed. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So the disciples are asking about both the destruction of the temple, which Jesus just foretold, and his second coming at the end of the age. And Jesus answers both questions in this passage. So this passage is about both the destruction of the temple and Jesus' second coming. And there's going to be some that say it's all about one or the other. Guys, that's just simply not what the disciples were asking, and that's not what Jesus said. And I could back that up with some stuff later, right? He says these things about the disciples, right? He's giving instruction to his disciples, which we'll talk about, especially in this first little bit. He's saying, see that no one leads you astray. He's giving all his disciples this information, implying that's going to be relevant to them, right? It's not going to be something that just happens way out in the future. There's something in their lives. There's something that's applicable right where they are. And then if we look at some of the stuff in here, again, we'll get into this, it really jives well with what historically happened with the destruction of the temple. But then also, if you look at verse 30, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. That's clearly talking about Jesus' second coming, right? The Son of Man appearing in the heavens and coming with power and glory. That's Jesus coming back. So I'm saying all this to say, guys, when you look at this, this is about both Jesus' second coming and something that happens before that, okay? So I'm just kind of setting the stage with that. What that means is this is in a sense, a farewell discourse that Jesus is giving to his disciples. What I mean by that is they've come and they've asked him a question and he's giving them a response. And this is not about some mysterious thing that they need to figure out or some secret code that they need to crack. It's a very practical, you need to know this so that you know how to live when I'm gone. And actually, if you read this, there's like 16 different commands that Jesus gives to them in this chapter. This is not esoteric theology. It's not meant to be that. It's not meant to be some secret mystery. It's meant to be, no, you need to know this information and here's how you live. So this is actually supposed to be a very, very practical thing. And here's how he breaks it down. Verses 4 through verse 28 is talking about what theologians will call the last days, or the already and the not yet. He's talking about the period of time in between when he leaves and when he comes back. Okay? That's what the last days or the already or the not yet is talking about. And if you've got more questions about that, I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But basically, this first section of this is talking about the period of time between Jesus' departure and return. Okay? And in that, he talks about a specific event in that time, which is the destruction of the temple. Okay? So that's the first half of this chapter. The second half of the chapter, starting in verse 29 and going through verse 51, is focused on his return, his second coming. Okay? So the disciples ask these questions in order, and Jesus answers the questions in order. So we'll start by looking at the first section. Now, why do I say it's about that whole period of time? Well, look at how he describes it, okay? Jesus is describing, hey, this is what's going to happen. There will be false teachers who come, verse 5, there will be many astray. You will hear of wars, rumors of wars, of violence. Verse 7, again, wars, violence, natural disasters, famines, earthquakes. Verse 9, tribulation, death, hatred, so persecution. Verse 10, many falling away, betraying one another, hating one another. Verse 11, again, false prophets, leaving astray. Verse 12, love growing cold. And then, verse 13, but the one who endures will be saved. Verse 14, the good news, the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world. That really sounds like the period of time we're living in, guys. That really sounds like the period of time that Paul talks about in all his letters, and Peter talks about in his letters, and the writer of the book of Hebrews talks about in his letters. They're talking about the period of time that we live in now, that has all these things. This wasn't just limited to the disciples' lifetime. This is the experience of all Christians. We experience all these things to a greater or to a lesser extent. And that verse 14 is really, really key. The gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony, and then the end will come. Okay? So that then the end will come is then Jesus' return will come, right? It's going to happen once the gospel has spread throughout the world. He's talking about this whole period of time before he comes back. And he talks about all these difficulties, all these things, and he says in verse 8 that these are but the beginnings of the birth pains. The birth of what? The birth of the kingdom of God, what's going to come into fruition, right? When Jesus comes back and makes all things new. So this is a description of what life is in certain aspects going to be before Jesus comes back. And the disciples obviously are going to be experiencing this in a bit of a more unique way. Then, in verses 15 through 28, there's this aside, okay? So, to keep the train of thought, what you could do, just to kind of help you straighten this out, if you look at verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Skip with me to verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Do you see how the thought continues? It's a seamless thought from verse 15 into verse 29. He talks about this is going to happen. This is what these days are going to be like, right? Verse 8, all of these, this language, these are these days. And then you get into verse 29, it's a seamless thought. Verses 15 through 28 are an aside. They're an interjection. They're hey, I've laid this out for you. Let me talk about a specific thing. And the specific thing he's talking about is the destruction of the temple. Right? Because they specifically asked about it because he had already talked about it. So, verse 15, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. So he's referencing something from the book of Daniel, this abomination of desolation. And what it's talking about the destruction of the temple. It's talking about the destruction of the first temple in Daniel, this prophecy looking forward. And Jesus is using this language, and his readers, his Jewish readers, right? Because Matthew's a very Jewish gospel. Again, look at the introduction if you want a primer on that. His Jewish readers would have been very, very familiar with this and would have understood that this abomination of desolation is talking about a temple destruction thing. We actually have a little more information because this has a parallel passage, right? This same speech from Jesus happens in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. And this verse, when you see the abomination of desolation was spoken by the prophet Daniel, in Luke 21:20, it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So this abomination of desolation is armies. It's a force. It's a military that's going to come in. And if you read this section here, and if you compare it to the historic accounts that we have of the destruction of the temple in AD 70, written by the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived through it, this so matches what actually happened to the temple. It just so clearly matches and so clearly fits with it that I think that it's very hard to draw any conclusion other than this is talking about the destruction of the temple. So what you have here is you have Jesus saying, hey, here's what life is going to be like before I come back, and here's a specific event in it because you asked about it, because I talked about it. Then in verse 28, he goes and he starts talking about his second coming. And again, like I said, I mean, verse 30, it's very, very clear that having Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, that is Jesus coming back. And I've already talked about how this verse 14 to verse 29, there's this seamless, response. So what he's doing is he's talking about Jesus' return. You have an interesting thing coming here. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Two things I want to point out here. The first is when he says in verse 14, this gospel will be proclaimed and then the end will come. In verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. That immediately is talking about this is the next major event to happen. It's not talking about no time will lapse between the two. Okay? The Greek word, the euthys, it can mean, hey, no time elapsing, but that's not its primary function. It's more about this, and then this is the next major event. Okay? So it's not about, hey, I don't get this. Jesus said no time will happen. All right? So then he progresses on. Verse 32, saying, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, Jesus, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What he's talking about there is he's not saying, verse 34, and this is one of the reasons that people will say that this passage only refers to the temple destruction in AD 70. Well, then how could Jesus say this generation that he's talking to won't pass away until all these things take place? Well, if you notice, he says, verse 33, these things does not include Jesus' second coming. These things includes the signs of his coming, right? When you see these things, you know he is near. So these things can't refer to his coming. They're the signs that his coming is the next thing to happen. It's the next imminent major thing. And what are those signs? It's not so much the destruction of the temple. It's the things he talked about at the beginning of the chapter. The troubles, the persecution, the hatred of the world, the wars, the struggles, these sort of things. And then he's saying, hey, when you see these things, you know that the return of Christ is imminent in terms of what's happening, in an eternal perspective. And I tell you the truth, this generation won't pass away until these things takes place, means these things are going to start now. So this isn't about some secret thing of like, hey, this is when Jesus is going to reappear. This is what life is going to immediately be like for the believer. In fact, what he says next reinforces that. He starts talking about concerning that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. So we can't use this as like, hey, these are secret clues to unlock when Jesus comes back. He says, you don't know when I'm going to come back. I don't know when I'm going to come back. Only the Father knows when I'm going to come back. But when life looks like this, when you see these signs, that means I could come back at any moment. So be ready, right, is what he's saying here. So there's a lot there, guys. I know I threw a lot at you, but let me kind of like bring this home. Let me kind of try and make this relevant, because I went in more detail than I normally would as to kind of what's going on here, because it's a difficult passage to interpret. And I said that Jesus is giving this to his disciples and then by extent to us for practical reasons, right? What are those reasons? Well, what are the things we should know? First, the first thing we see here is we should, as Christians, expect difficulty and trouble and persecution. Jesus says it's going to happen. We should expect it. In fact, he says, what? Don't be alarmed. Verse 6, when these things happen. He says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. So he's saying to his disciples, he's saying to us, don't be alarmed when life looks like this. In fact, you should expect it. And the reason he talks so much about don't be led astray and false teachers is, isn't this such a common tactic of Satan and such a common thing we see, is that when life gets difficult for us, we instinctively ask, where is God? What is he doing? How can this be good? Why should I trust him? These bad things are happening, right? That's what our hearts naturally do, and the temptation is when things get really, really difficult and really bad and really challenging, how can this be what God wants us to do? And you have lots of false teachers coming in saying, hey, I've got the secret. Hey, if I tell you, you live this way, you can have an amazing life with no trouble or no difficulty or any of that kind of stuff. And Jesus says, don't be led astray. I'm telling you these things will happen. So don't be surprised when these things happen in your life. Third is be encouraged, because he knows. God knows this is all in his plan, right? So when we have difficulties, when there are disasters, when there are sicknesses, when there is persecution, when there is death, this is part of God's plan. So be encouraged by that, right? This must happen, is what he says in verse 6. We also see here in verse 22? This is he's talking specifically about the destruction of the temple, but there's a principle here. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Even though it doesn't seem like it for us, God is restraining evil, and he's cutting tribulation and difficulty short for the sake of his people, for the sake of his elect, his chosen ones. The world is not as bad as it should be, and that's because God is actively holding it back. The next one, and this is one of the main ones that Jesus talks about, is be ready, right? Be ready. Anticipate that Jesus could come back at any time. This is what life is like, and he can come back at any moment. We shouldn't be caught unawares. We shouldn't waste time. We shouldn't pass by the opportunities that we have to draw close to him or to love him. We shouldn't assume that every single day of our lives is going to look a certain way and we have all the time in the world. Jesus could come back at any time, so be ready. He will come unexpectedly, like the flood came to those who weren't watching for it, or like a thief in a night is to those who are unprepared. He says, be ready for my return. And there's so many applications of that. And the last is hope. He is coming back. We will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, and that is when the birth pains will end and life will begin. When the kingdom of God will be brought fully into fruition, because birth pains are terrible and they're real and they're painful and they're awful, but they're temporary. And what happens as a result of those birth pains is so good and so glorious that we know those things happen, but we don't remember it anymore, because the result of life is so worth it and so much better. And that's the picture that he gives us. So hope that he's going to come back and he's going to make all things new. Like I said, guys, I know that was a lot. I hit that hard and went really quickly. And I said it was going to be 25 minutes, and it's about 30 minutes, so there you go. But I hope this was helpful to you. I hope this was encouraging to you. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I look forward to continuing this study with you guys next week.